Tom Alexander is a director at Aukett Swanke, who are international architects and master planners, interior designers, and they have a strong R&D function as well. The practice works across a wide variety of sectors, and Tom's a trustee of the Higher Education Design Quality Forum, or HDQF, and a member of the NLA expert panel on tall buildings. So, Tom, can you start by telling me a bit about the practice, what it does and where it works?
We've kind of arrived from a journey of over 115 years, we call it since 1906, a whole series of mergers, which is extraordinary, starting in Manhattan and New York, actually, to end up where we are today. So I come to you as a director of the London practice, and that's very much our focus, London, the UK, but we also work on projects overseas. So Central, Eastern Europe, and a little bit in the Middle East as well. We have a kind of collective design culture. So we sit around the table and thrash out ideas with each other a lot. We very much focus, and I'm sure most people do now, on people and the planet. Absolutely always been there, but it's great to see that as a major series of issues now, well-being and climate. We like to blend a lot of things. So we're blending people's ideas within the studio. That's mine to other people's, theirs to mine. And that comes through then in the projects as well. So we're blending sectors. The sectors we work in are education, residential, workplace, industrial, life sciences, hospitality. They're the main focus ones, but a lot of hybrids of those. And that's become, in a way for us, a sector in itself, mixing them. And I'll talk a bit more about that, sort of particularly residential and industrial, and in London as well.
Tell me a bit about the projects that you're working on yourself.
They have quite often been R&D led. So over the period of time, over the last 15 years, I've been with the practice actually. I did R&D into school design, and that led us to go and start working on some of the school projects during that big program 10 or so years ago. More recently, industrial, we were asked to look at the industrial typology for urban and civic up in Alconbury, and we didn't reinvent the shed, but we refreshed it. And on the back of that, we were invited by SEGRO to pitch for some work to look at hybrids of those, which was fascinating. And I'll tell you a bit more about those. But I've also historically worked a lot in education. So the Jenny Lee building for the Open University was really a kind of bringing together of two departments, the Institute of Educational Technology and the Department of Computing. And that was a kind of an American idea, blending, if you like, different colleges, different departments within a university. And so the whole design became a really interesting project of how do you get people to work together who quite often don't want to. So there's a lot of social working spaces, and it became a real forming idea and project for us that led on to looking at workplace in general. We're working currently on projects similar to that, one called Steam House for the Birmingham City University, which is being built right now, which is fascinating, and lots of similar ideas. It blends academia with work and industry all within the same building. So how they all get on is very important. The Molecular Science Research Hub for Imperial College London, which is on the Imperial West site, is just completed. Actually went through an extraordinary transition from being a sort of an academic building to a laboratory building. So the building had to be very agile and flexible during the design process. We're also looking at pure industrial buildings in London. So I'm doing some work for storage companies. In fact, we've looked at over 30 different sites across London in the last 4 or 5 years at looking at how to retain employment, but particularly industrial employment, and then adding new uses to it. So that can be residential, but it could be more industrial, or it could be offices. To be honest, it's whatever we really need as a city and as a group of people. And I think the whole COVID thing and the well-being is changing that towards some of that intensification. So that's been fascinating. I think just lastly on that, on the project side as well, a few years ago, we were asked by Canary Wharf to look at the office building and say, how do we attract the tech industry to Canary Wharf? And our big starting point was where you have to create a much more agile variety of spaces than the typical 4 meter floor to floor office building generates or offers at the moment. And I think that was a piece of work that was a kind of bit like Marmite. Half of them loved it and the other half weren't sure. But it's now feeding into what we do. And with current issues around health and well-being, it's become even more important to create volume and fresh air a variety of spaces to move through and go to and feel healthy and safe. So the projects are really a mixture of built things which have been formative for us, and then a lot of R&D feeding into new ways of thinking and new ways of looking at things.
So in terms of those ideas around co-location of industrial, residential and other uses, and currently at the moment with the boom in logistics as a result of COVID-19, how do you see that sort of taking off as a typology in London, and where will we put them?
Well, it's very interesting. As I said, I think earlier, we started this with an invitation to bid on some work with SEGRO. SEGRO are very interested in looking at that hybrid typology, basically putting residential onto a piece of land where there was some industrial. And we won a competition really with them to do that. So we started doing some test sites, and we're doing them in West London and then further in. And since then, it's just grown and grown. And we've now looked at over 30 sites for a whole variety of clients, all sorts of different scales of big industrial companies to small individual landowners. And they are all over London. They are anywhere where there is currently some employment use that tends towards the heavier employment. So manual, craft, industrial, light industrial, storage, anywhere there's a footprint of basically a single story building covering quite a large footprint with an opportunity to use some of the air above it to build on. And that led us to testing all of the thinking. I mean, all of the challenges, put resi on everyone, everyone starts saying, but what about noise, pollution, living together, co-location? How do you actually walk to your front door of your resi without feeling disturbed by the industrial activities? And it's just created a new kind of approach for us. The front door has to be not compromised for the resi. The way you live can't be compromised in any way. The industrial part can't be compromised in any way. It still needs sometimes a 50-meter deep yard. It needs 10-meter clear high spaces. And that whole approach just led us to sort of do simple things like, well, on the plan, let's separate those out very quickly when you come onto this footprint of the plan of the site. But then we can actually blend the front doors together. So the front door of the industrial could have far more visibility into what's going on inside it, because they're extraordinary. The stuff going inside a shed can be as wonderful as a prop store for the movie industry or an Aston Martin service garage, but you never know. But it can also be somebody, a guy just who makes chain links and puts them together in chains and then sells them to somebody who needs a chain. Very sort of mundane looking, but if you just get a little window into that and they can see what's going on outside, you make that great connection with the community. And all of that's so key to make it work, because the public realm, I think the space that you walk past these buildings in, needs to feel connected to what's going on inside it. So it was, Southwark have got a nice phrase for it now. They call it windows on work. So you can see a little bit of what's going on inside. Then when you've got residential, for example, above it, the front door to that residential is just sitting next to another front door. It just happens to be of a bigger scale. And there are still people in there who are very much part of the community. So we kind of felt we could blend those communities, and that was the most important thing, and the public realm is the key to that. Then you've got all the technical issues about acoustics and noise and pollution and structure and transfers. But we've worked on so many now with a variety of consultants and a variety of client types. We've gone through storage companies, marble owners, large sort of Travis Perkins organizations who have lots of footprints all over the sites. We've worked with people who've got a lot of footprints, and we're still under sort of NDAs on quite a lot of these because they've gone through feasibility studies, most of them, and they're just looking to explore what is possible. And some of them are now going through to planning, which is really exciting, including stuff on the river. So a wharf building that we're doing called Orchard Wharf, which has gone in for planning now. But it's very interesting how we can intensify the use of a city. I think what's come into focus now, in particular with the logistics, was the start of your question, is really a broader view on how London works and how it's going to work going forwards as an infrastructure for a city that's suffering from, or a whole world that's suffering from this pandemic, which is, COVID-19. But the clue for me is it's number 19. So there were 18 before, and there will be more in the future. So we've got to take this on now. And I think the logistics thing has become a massive part in the way people service their lives in terms of ordering stuff online and getting it delivered. And there's been lots of huge steps to minimize the impact that has on a city in terms of vehicle movement. The e-bicycle, the cargo bike, is brilliant, and that's something that should replace all white vans. Give them a nice proper dry coat and the little bit of motor that helps them, and you can deliver a massive amount in one of those cradles at the front, which are fantastic. So all of that's getting better, but there's a very exciting question about the whole structure of the city of London and others, New York, Paris, Moscow, about how we move forward. So whilst we started looking at logistics and putting residential on top, it's become a much wider sort of exploration for us and many others now, which is very, very interesting. And then the height, the tall, how tall we go. I think hybrids have been happening in places like Shanghai and Hong Kong and other eastern places, but also in Manhattan. Grand Central Station is an infrastructure building, but above it is a hotel, and above that offices, and above that residential. And they've all blended together, and that was over 100 years ago. So we don't claim the ideas as new, but we certainly are interpreting them for London and its needs. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of projects. I mean, a lot in Old Kent Road. We've done them in West London around Kew Bridge. We're doing one called Rectory Farm, which it actually got planning consent through another practice, and then the client decided to go to a competition. So we went out to about 20 international practices, which we happened to win. So it's just near Heathrow. There's 3 million square feet of space below ground where the gravel is being dug up and used for the construction industry, mainly concrete mix as an aggregate. And that's quite often just filled in with water. So it'll just be a lake, somebody fishing at. And their idea is to turn that into usable space, logistic space, with above it a public park. So it's quite an extraordinary project, and not a park like you'd ever imagine. It's really like a membrane between a lower ground operation and a public space. And that membrane has holes in it in order to get daylight and air through it. So we've gone from sitting in a room with Segro talking about a shed and some apartments above it to a huge scale. And they're all in London, and they're all different, and they all have different clients and different ambitions. But they want to intensify, and they want to retain employment. So we found a lot of support from councils, from landowners, from the GLA. It varies from project to project, but it's an extraordinary. It is you say it's a new kind of typology. It's a new asset class in many ways as well, and it is challenging. So you really need to get a group of people sitting around the table who are willing to sort of push the thing and make it work and overcome a lot of resistance in many cases. And we do it very gently, and you do it very scientifically. As we do so, we've found answers as a group, and that's just been really exhilarating, but also optimistic for future.
Clearly, we need to have a flexible city to adapt to the changes which are likely to happen in the way we use it. But also we need, I think, flexible buildings. There's been increased interest in recent years over the idea of long life, loose fit. And I know you designed some flexible office buildings which did that. And don't we need to all adhere to the long life, loose fit strategy, particularly as we move towards a more circular economy for sustainability reasons?
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. The one I mentioned in Canary Wharf was the start of that for us in many ways, because we created a chassis, an architectural chassis, we call it the chassis, which is basically 8 meters floor to floor, so that you created volumes. And in those volumes, they're hugely adaptable and agile. You can do a lot of different things in them. We started out by saying that's how the tech industry likes to work. They come from a garage to an industrial building to an office building. And they sort of started changing workplace and questioning the 4 meters floor to floor vertical factory, which was in many ways driven by a CEO saying we need a productive workforce and this is how they'll stack vertically. And now you have the tech industry coming along and saying, well, we enjoy daylight, volume, fresh air, flexibility, variety of spaces. We will work on a staircase, and the whole Spanish step typology emerged, and everyone uses it, and it's brilliant. I love it. And the other thing is the ground floor, the urban lounge, where you can go in as a member of the public and use that building space so that the public realm goes into the building and your security line is set. The whole thing about the chassis for us was that it's adaptable. That was for the tech industry, but as soon as we showed it to people, they started saying, well, you could use that for all sorts of other things. You could put a 2-story prefabricated house in there and put it on one floor. So suddenly the whole thing, well, it's a living model. Okay, so we could transform this into living quite easily. We were talking to Barclays investment, just showing them at Canary Wharf to show them what they could do, and they said, well, we've got this whole education fund that we could put further education colleges in there. We could put 4 of them in there, and then you reuse the land on the other 3 sites. It really is about, for us, it became this 100-year building at least, and that's absolutely what we should do. So long life loose fit is completely right. It was a vertical structure that we looked at. But we've since been taking that and lying it down in certain situations and saying, well, you could do this horizontally. And essentially it's, you take a kind of industrial frame, if you like, and you create the volume. And inside that volume, because we were looking at it originally up in Alconbury, we realized they were stunningly flexible, agile spaces. And the demands on them now are that they are workplaces as good as anything. So it's as good as the best office in the City of London. They need, daylight, fresh air, air tightness, thermal insulation. They need all the green credentials. And they're biospheres, essentially. They're massive, enormous spaces where you start planting other aspects of the program of life. And so we found that the low-lying building actually just on its own is extraordinary. We were asked to look at the inside of Here East. Hawkins Brown did the outside, and a great job, love it, great scheme. But we were asked to look at this 2-volume space that was no daylight, no fresh air. So we put a Manhattan grid on it, which meant that we carved daylight and fresh air into 2 avenues and 3 cross streets, and it created 12 development plots inside it, so it was like a village. And we got some images of that, and it was really to help the people. It was a data center, and sort of show them how you could transform an industrial building. And we're now designing, and that's transforming an old one. We're now designing new buildings where they're a bit like an industrial building. We'll take the simple structural frame, the grid sort of beam, and multiply it across a site, and then say, right, that's the volume we're working in. Now let's get into the program of what we need. So it became the enclosure, and the most recent one we've done is actually in Moscow, and it was for an educational institution, but with workplace. So it's a bit like a sort of the whole building in this big, long industrial type space is like from the nursery to the boardroom. So one end you're learning at junior and infant level, and the other end there's a workplace. And they're very similar spaces now. We've noticed they've been influencing each other. So that structural kind of envelope is a long life loose fit building, and inside it the program can be moved around. The film industry recognizes this. They're constantly building sets inside big sheds because they recognize it's so easy and flexible. It's so controllable as an environment. It's just that now that they're getting better and better for the people who work in them. I think the other thing is that we're then looking. We've always been looking at London on these hybrids, but we've started to take it outside. So co-location and hybrids around the edges of London in slightly more brownfield sites is interesting. And the whole business park typology, which is so dominated by the car and designed for the car, by the car. And we want to flip all of that and say, well, let's design a landscape in which we plant buildings. And those buildings could be a multitude of uses. But then immediately the spaces in between them become far more friendly and an opportunity to work outside of the building enclosure itself. And the buildings become a little bit like sheds. So we've gone over this whole sort of thing where it was 4 or 5 years ago, we were asked to refresh the shed typology, and we've ended up sort of talking about whole cities and urban and rural locations. Fascinating journey.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Interesting to hear your enthusiasm about innovation, which gives a very positive view of the future city as we come out of COVID-19. So thank you very much.
Good, you're welcome. Thanks very much for having me.